back to Author Talk, and today I'm here with Leslie Kerr, who wrote a book about a very fascinating woman named Harriet Quimb. Do you want to tell us a little bit about her?
Sure. Harriet Quimb was a woman of many firsts. She was a journalist first and foremost. That's how she started her career, but that opened a lot of different doors for her, and she loved to live life to the fullest, so she explored all of these avenues that opened for her. So she was, in fact, a journalist, as I say, for a publication called Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, which was kind of the Time magazine of its day. Published 1875 to 1922, I think, was its last issue. She wrote over 250 articles for Leslie's Weekly on issues that we still talk about today. She was very socially conscious: labor law, immigration, women's rights, civil rights, environment, very ahead of her time. She was fascinated by aviation. She was 20 years before Amelia Earhart. She was the first woman in the United States to earn her pilot's license in 1911. And she was the first U.S. female to successfully cross the English Channel. The only reason why she didn't get the publicity she ordinarily would have received was the Titanic had sunk 2 days before, so she was very disappointed that she was kind of shoved to the back pages of the Times, despite the tragedy of the event. But anyway, she was the first woman in the U.S. to own and operate a car. She covered a car show in 1909 and was just fascinated by it. So she wrote screenplays for D.W. Griffith, first credited female screenwriter.
That's what I found so fascinating about, this is mostly about her flying, but I thought that was very interesting.
Well,
first screenwriter.
Yes, and that's the interesting thing about Harriet Quimb, because anything that's ever been, I mean, she lived 36 years. She was born in 1875. She was dead by 1912. In an air crash, but she accomplished so much, and what had been written about her was strictly about her aviation career, which was certainly jaw-dropping, but she did so much more and set the tone for so many areas. She designed the first flight clothes for women. Women in 1910 wore big hoop skirts and earrings, big hats and bustles. And she said, this is absurd. You can't even get into a plane, let alone fly it. So she designed kind of like it was a walking skirt, but you could pull it up to the waist and button it at the waist so it looked like trousers. And purple was her favorite color, so her outfits would be wool lined, so they would be warm, but they were all in glorious shades of plum. And she was just she's a beautiful girl, and just a trendsetter, but not in a flip flamboyant sort of way. I think that's what, as a journalist myself, that's what really drew me to her story. And I've often thought, and I think people who read the book, and I think you discovered this too, when you hear these things about her, you just think, my goodness, had she lived, what she might have accomplished.
Yeah, and something that struck me as part of, as another writer and researcher, is how did you even start with this person? Because she has so many things about her. Where does one start with some a research project like this about a person like this?
That's an interesting question. I will tell you how I met her. First of all, my husband and I were visiting the Cradle of Aviation Museum on Long Island. And if you know anything about aviation, you know that they call it the Cradle of Aviation because that's really where in this country aviation got its start. So we were visiting the museum, and a friend of ours was giving us a tour, and I saw this mannequin in this beautiful plum-hued flight outfit, and I thought, oh, it must be Amelia Earhart. And our friend said, "Oh no, that's Harriet Quimby," and proceeded to tell us about her. And I think, and you know this, you're a writer, anything that kind of sparks an interest, you want to know more. So I thought, that'd be an interesting story. So I just started to research, and initially, of course, plugged into the aviation prong of her life. But as very often happens, and I'm sure you've discovered this yourself, once you get into researching, this leads to this, and this leads to this, and pretty soon you have, and then it becomes, and this is a good thing, reining it in to what specifically you want to do to tell a person's story or a story about anything. And you learn so much. I discovered things about what was going on in the world at the time she lived, and things that I maybe had heard about but had not really any idea of the depth or the broadness, and how many people it affected. So so I started with the aviation. That was the piece of it. And then I discovered, oh, she wrote screenplays, and she was one of the Bohemian group with the likes of Jack London and Ambrose Bierce, and because her parents moved around a lot, and they ended up in Northern California, and she actually started out as a model, a hat and glove model in those days, and she got involved with the Bohemian writers, and that was how she was introduced to journalism, and just started to write for the Monterey Call, which I think may still be in existence, the Monterey Call, nice community newspaper of the time. And then it was a few years after that, this was the early part of the 20th century, she decided she was going to go to New York, because that's where the hub, really, of writing and journalism was at that time. So she was not afraid to, and this is what I loved about her, not afraid to face challenge or adventure. She was not afraid to speak her mind. In a time where, yes, the suffragette movement was going on, she did not consider herself a suffragette. She believed that anybody should explore their interests and their life's pursuit, and was not afraid to do that in a time where women just did not have options, and actually thought suffragettes did themselves a disservice by,
I have to say, definitely, reading through, she feels like somebody you kind of want to be buddies with, or she's very fun person, very outgoing, and if she lived today, she'd probably be one of those people dragging you to everywhere and having a good old time. And I really liked a lot of her quotes that you put at the beginning of chapters. Although one of them wasn't at the beginning of the chapter, but it made me laugh. Where she got her, either she won a aerial race or maybe got her license or something to do with aerial things, and they said, "Oh, is it difficult?" And she said, "It's not as difficult as voting."
Yeah,
that amused me quite a bit.
Yes, and yes, she had, and even the balance of her philosophies, I think, was apparent in the quotes she made. She talked about the meaning of friendship, and just to sit across the table from a friend and have a cup of tea, and how meaningful that was. And at the same time, she's talking about flying the English Channel, and she knew mechanics. She checked her plane each time before she had a flight to make sure that things weren't working. She instinctively knew what to listen for. So she was this marvelous array of people. Yeah,
and I noticed you have a lot of good pictures in there. Were those difficult to kind of pull up? Or?
The Library of Congress was my best friend, which I'm sure is often the case when you're writing about something over 100 years old. I was a little concerned at the beginning of this project because I knew there were wonderful photos available, surprisingly enough. but they were over 100 years old. I mean, she was dead by 1912. So I was concerned that the quality of photos that we could find and use would not complement the story. But that proved not to be the case. You know, we live in a wonderful digital age now where you can take something that looks like, oh my gosh, and I mean, I think you still got the sense of the old quality of the photos.
Yeah.
But they were, I think, well reproduced, and
they were nice pictures.
Yes, they were viable illustrations of her life. So yes, and that was great fun, because then you started discovering all these wonderful pictures of bygone era.
So I talked to someone else who did another sort of nonfiction book. You're now the second person on Author Talk who's done a nonfiction. And I asked her, she kind of felt that by the end of her project, she kind of personally knew these people and were friends with them. Like, did you feel like that as well?
Yes. I find myself very excited about talking about Harriet. Mm-hmm. I feel like if she were sitting right here, I would know what to ask her, and I would know how she would respond. And you're right, that you could just have a wonderful time with her. Yes, and it's like doing a character sketch for a fiction character. You know, the more you develop a fiction character, the more you know them, and the more when you place them in your plot, you kind of know how they're going to react or what they're going to do. It's the same way with nonfiction, really, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's fact, and you don't want to deviate from that. Unfortunately, in Harriet's case, there was so much that was, I think, interesting and exciting to read about. Mm-hmm. That was very easy. But yes, I would say that Harriet, and I feel, and this may sound maybe bizarre, but I've given many talks now on Harriet, and I do feel like I'm sharing her message. Mm-hmm. Like there was a voice there that had a message to communicate about, again, as I said earlier, many of the things we're talking about today. Mm-hmm. And I think she would want that to be known.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm on a mission here with her.
Yeah, and I think it's great. You know, recently there's been so many upsurgences of people putting these women's stories out there, saying like, well, you know, we have these stories that are given to us in elementary school about who the firsts were, but maybe that's not true. And
quite accurate.
We've
yes.
got, you know, we've got Harriet Quimb, we've got you know, the forefathers of rock and roll were women, and like the, you know, so many others. It's just insane. And so it's good now. Like, you think it's 2016. Like, it's time to sort of give these people the voices that they should have had the whole time.
Yes, I totally agree. I think that there are many people throughout our history who, for whatever reason, their voice hasn't been heard, and they've made a real contribution in many fields. And so that's kind of become my, I actually seek mm-hmm. those kinds of people out now, and because I've always loved nonfiction. And so that's kind of become my path.
So are you working on something now, or do you have previous projects you want to talk about?
I am actually working on, and you probably have never heard of this person. Can I just say one more thing about Harriet?
Yeah. Go.
And everyone I talk to says the same thing. So this is kind of, Harriet was number one, and this is kind of 1B project, to make a documentary of her life, mm-hmm. which I've had many people bring that up to me. So I really would like to bring that to fruition. And so we're kind of working on that right now to get a documentary about her life. But from the print standpoint, there was a man by the name of Earl Carroll I don't know. You don't know who Earl Carroll is. He was a man a showman, who started out on the East Coast and migrated to the West Coast. He was where we would call, everybody's probably heard of Florence Ziegfeld. Have you heard of the Ziegfeld girls or Florence Ziegfeld?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, Flo Ziegfeld was kind of the champagne and caviar of showmanship in New York in the early part of the 20th century. Earl Carroll was like that, but he was more the beer and pretzel type of showman, but had 2 theaters in New York. He called them Earl Carroll's Vanities, and he literally started the career of many, many, many young women. Lucille Ball, Jane Froman, of varying levels of success, some not so much. But I've had the privilege recently, as I've gotten into the research of this man, to interview some of their descendants of original Carroll girls. But when he went out to the West Coast, he actually built a theater, which is now the world headquarters for Nickelodeon, on Sunset.
I've been there.
Yeah, the headquarters? Well, that was the original. So do you remember the big picture of the woman? Do you recall seeing that? That was from the original club, and that was a woman by the name of Burrow Wallace, who was his kind of common law wife for 10 years, and they ironically were killed in an air crash in 1948. But anyway, he started this theater, but and it opened on Christmas Day in 1938. People like Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, all of these celebrities just would go to Earl Carroll, his theater. And so he was known for his grand theatrical productions, but he also did things like create really the first rising stage where dancers merged from the floor somewhere, and so it was very technical, but very detail oriented with costumes and the way the show had to be, and composed a lot of his music. And so for a long time I wondered, well, gee, we've heard so much about Florence Ziegfeld, but nobody's really ever talked about Earl Carroll. And I happen to know about it because a dear friend of mine's wife had been an Earl Carroll girl. So I had been a dancer as a young girl, and so I knew the name. And I've just, as I say, I've started kind of looking at people who I think really have made contributions in different fields and want to write about them. And there has not been anything written about Earl Carroll, so I am working on that, and I'm pretty excited about it. Yeah,
I can't wait to read that. All right, well, thank you for joining me here.
My pleasure.
Again, this is Leslie Kerr, and her book is Harriet Quimb,
Flying Fair Lady.
Flying Fair Lady, which I found on the Kindle store, but you can also, is there a hard copy version of it you can get as well?
There is on Amazon and in Barnes & Noble.
So yes. Definitely check those out, because they're very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.